impact across the whole of the country. More than 21 million people, that's 80% of the population, now need humanitarian assistance. Health facilities report that over 2,800 people have been killed and 13,000 injured since the violence escalated in March. At least 1,400 civilians have lost their lives, and these numbers are likely to be significant underestimates. The parties to this conflict show an utter disregard for human life, repeatedly attacking civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, power stations, and water installations. 1 million people have been forced from their homes. Some have been targeted even as they fled. Earlier this month, displaced people who had fled Harad were targeted in airstrikes that killed 4 civilians and injured 41. Civilians have been killed and injured in indiscriminate shelling in Aden, Al-Dara, and Ta'if. One Yemeni woman told my colleagues that without a political solution, there will soon be nothing left of the country. Another said she was trying to keep her family going in Stone Age conditions. More than 20 million people lack access to safe water and sanitation. Dengue fever and malaria have been reported in the south and in areas bordering Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the health system is facing imminent collapse with the closure of at least 160 health facilities due to insecurity and lack of fuel or other critical supplies. Food insecurity affects half the population. 10 of Yemen's 22 governorates are classified as being in food emergency. That's one step below famine. Despite all this, local and international NGOs and UN and other agencies have reached some 4.4 million people with humanitarian aid since the escalation of the conflict. Emergency food assistance has been delivered to 1.9 million people. Fuel has been delivered to pump water in 11 governorates, and 700,000 people benefit from daily water trucking services. Medical supplies have been delivered for almost 500,000 people. As large as these figures are, they represent a fraction of the people in need. Humanitarians are scaling up our operations, but access into and within Yemen is a major challenge. Delays at Yemeni ports are compounded by fuel shortages that mean goods cannot be transported onward. Humanitarian convoys are regularly stopped at checkpoints or roadblocks, delayed by parties to the conflict, or postponed because of active conflict. We have repeatedly called for the resumption of commercial imports at pre-crisis levels to avoid even more serious hunger and shortages. I repeated my call in my statement to the Council yesterday. Commercial imports are currently at an estimated 15% of pre-crisis levels. Clearly, this is insufficient in a country that imported 90% of its goods before the current crisis. Finally, I will echo the Special Envoy's call for an urgent ceasefire to end the suffering of millions of people. We continue to advocate for humanitarian pauses during which civilians can reach areas of safety and life-saving assistance can be delivered to people in need. Thank you, and I'll now take your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Obrien. As you can all see, or you could briefly see the photo of Mr. Obrien, but as you might know, he is not able to see you, so it would be great if all of you can identify yourself before you ask your questions, and please speak clearly into the microphone. Evelyn?
Mr. Obrien, thank you. Evelyn Leopold from the United Nations Correspondents Association and a contributor to Huffington Post. How can you predict if famine is, how far away would you say it is from famine? And secondly, is one side worse than the other as far as striking at civilians and carelessness about their lives?
Thank you. I heard the question. I think that the reason that we have these levels for saying it's one step away from famine is because we still have the chance to avert the famine, because if we can get the supplies in, it will not get to the point where we have people starving to the point where they cannot get at least one meal the following day. So that is the level, and at this stage, it is to alert to the stage where we have time to avert this if we can get the supplies in. That is why we called it for a pause, so we can get that safety in place for access. And the second question you asked was whether one side is worse than the other. We have no evidence to suggest that. When we talk about 20 million people lacking safe water or 21 million people needing humanitarian assistance, that reflects the estimate and accurately counted numbers across the whole of Yemen relating to the Yemeni people as a whole.
Yes, in the back. Yes, please.
Thank you for this briefing. My name
please
is...
identify. Oh, thanks.
Okay. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. Would you please explain more to us which obstacles you have to bring the reliefs and to bring help to people? Like which problems exactly are facing and why?
Thank you. Well, you can imagine that both following the flash appeal in April and more recently the update, we have got a number of pledges which we have welcomed. That is in addition to the Saudi pledge. We have money from the UK. I make a decision to allocate $25 million from the SIR, and that is now able to proceed, and there are there is financial support now from a vast number of others. We are in particular working with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on the modalities of transferring the humanitarian funds that were pledged to help Yemeni people. I mean, of course, I cannot speak myself on behalf of donors or indeed determine the decisions made by them with regard to timing, all the recipients, or indeed other factors related to humanitarian funding. I should add that there's $100 million from Kuwait, which is being targeted direct. So these are now at the stage of converting from pledge to secured modalities of supplying. So the timing is not in my hands, although I'm certainly doing everything I can to urge the speed of these transactions so we can get the aid in. Every day lost are more lives at risk and lost.
Thank you, Mr. Obrien. My name is Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television in Lebanon. I understand you have paid a visit to Saudi Arabia to discuss the delivery of aid and the honoring of the pledges. How successful was your trip? Also, can you describe to us the situation in the northern governorates of Yemen, especially Hajjah, Sa'da, Ma'rib, and Jawf? How badly are they affected by the conflict?
On the first question, I did go to visit Saudi Arabia. I had a very constructive meeting. Saudi Arabia is an important partner in humanitarian relief funding, and I've been able to follow that up, as indeed have people from my office. That has meant that there has been clarity about the immediate plans that can be put in place to deliver this very, very needed aid and the humanitarian relief. So that is, that from the point of view of success, it is of course within that important partnership, it is work in progress as we aim to secure the modalities that can then deliver this humanitarian aid as speedily as possible. Secondly, on the question about the northern governorates, I don't have the precise data in front of me, but suffice it to say that I have seen no reporting or evidence which would particularly strongly distinguish between any part of the whole of the country of Yemen. All governorates are now in grave difficulty with the people in them under intense pressure, and this appears to be effectively across, as we have the information at the moment, 22 governorates being classified as being in food emergency, as I mentioned in my statement. I think that gives you a pretty good idea that it's quite difficult to distinguish as one geography versus another. I think we're talking about the whole of the country in a very serious crisis, and that the people, therefore, within it right across the country are facing very similar, extraordinarily challenging and dire conditions.
A quick
Carol?
follow-up on that, please. Just a quick follow-up. There were complaints from our viewers, those we interviewed on the ground in those governorates. They said that their names were taken up to 5 times, and they did not receive any aid until now.
I'm obviously sorry to hear that. That, as I understand it, there hasn't been any discrimination of one part versus another. Of course, everything to do with the supply of humanitarian aid, even by the very brave people who are currently managing to secure some channels. You heard what I was able to report of the amount of aid, despite the absolutely dire conditions, was nonetheless getting through. But of course, all aid in terms of humanitarian support to save lives and to try and avert famine and other crises is highly dependent upon access. And in conflict conditions, that inevitably is both uneven, certainly it's patchy, and so those who have not received aid, that's extraordinarily serious, and we must seek to do everything we can to be universal, but it is highly dependent upon the ability to have access.
Carol? Carol.
Mr. O'Brien, I'm Carol Landry with AFP, Agence France Presse. I just wanted to clarify the situation with the ports. Have the Saudis told you that they're willing to lift the maritime blockade?
The discussions on the question of port access is that it's not so much the port itself, so much as the question about the cargoes that are coming in and what is the appropriate inspection regime that should accompany that. And there have been, as you can well imagine, a number of discussions. It is clear that absolutely as you would expect, in accordance with the principles that we are governed by, that we expect that the UN ships should be allowed into port unimpeded. The conditions within certainly one port that I've had reports of, Aden, but may well be true of others, that the actual physical conditions in the port are very, very difficult because of competing and contested space. But the main thing is that there should be a light touch regime under the UN chapeau to ensure that ships in the commercial sector are given that level of inspections so that from international waters they're able to proceed. Let's be absolutely clear. It's vital that we get commercial ships back in. Yemen before the crisis depended upon those imports from ships by commercial ships to the tune of 90%. We're down, as I said, 15% of pre-crisis levels. So we have been calling for the resumption of these commercial imports, which means that we need to finalise the confidence that all those who have an input on the question of inspection are satisfied with the arrangements now in place, and we therefore need to get those ships in.
Matthew?
Sure. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for calling into the briefing. I wanted to ask, I'm looking at the OCHA situation report, and I have a couple of questions. One is, what's the status of the international staff that were pulled out of the country returning from Amman and elsewhere? What percentage have returned, and have they returned, throughout the country? And also, the situation report describes an ambulance being destroyed in Sadr, but it doesn't say who did it. And I'm wondering, since targeting or destroying medical equipment in wartime can be a war crime, do you have any idea how this ambulance was destroyed? And the status also of cholera in the country. The report mentions cholera twice. Are there in fact cases, and what's being done? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. On the question of the ambulance, I'm afraid I have no further or better information, so I can't help you on that. I will continue to do my very best to ask the questions and make inquiries, but at the moment I have nothing that I'm able to add. On the question of cholera, again, I've not been given any specific reports about cholera. Clearly, as is mentioned, it has to be very prudent for us to recognise in the current conditions that it is a risk. John Ging, in the statement that we made yesterday to the Security Council that he did on my behalf, recognises the risk of cholera as the case in the current circumstances of all waterborne diseases. But at the moment, what we do have are much firmer reports of dengue fever in particular and malaria, which is normally controllable, being reported in the south and in areas bordering Saudi Arabia, which is obviously of concern. And certainly in relation to your first question about international staff, rather than being specific about particular people, as you will be aware, in terms of international humanitarian staff, the international staff who were at a level of about 17, that's 17, that has been raised to 70. I believe the number who have returned are broadly in the region of about half of that number as we currently speak, but with clear plans to get to the 70. And we are looking at being able to raise that level. But of course, this is dependent on having appropriate security arrangements to about 200. The question of deployment across the country is obviously not a matter which I would want to particularly share at this stage, and I'm sure you appreciate the reasons for that.
Masood?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Masood Haider. I represent Daily Dawn newspaper of Pakistan. Mr. Obrien, Saudi Arabia announced, I think, $100 million aid at the same time that it began saturation bombing of the country. So how can you please explain how did the attacks by the so-called coalition forces have impacted, in the real sense, this whole thing, and why is Saudi Arabia aid taking such a long time to get in?
I have to apologise. I couldn't quite hear the first part of your question. You talked, I think, about $100 million of who?
Saudi Arabia announced, I think, 100 million or in excess of $100 million, I say, humanitarian aid at the beginning of the at the outset of the conflict.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
I understand. Let us be clear. On the 19th of April, we issued the flash appeal, and the response from Saudi Arabia was both generous and appreciated to step up to the pledge, and they put 100% in the pledge on the table. It has taken the time. It was also coincided with the establishment, again, very welcome, of the King Salman Humanitarian Relief and Aid Centre, and we're obviously been working with them with regard to how they would wish to deploy that, and that is the normal process, as you know, once you have a flash appeal. Since then, we've had the revised numbers, which we did when I was in Geneva last week, and that's when we've been able to secure the various further fundings from a range of other countries and organisations, which is, again, all very welcome. So, and you asked about the association. The issue about humanitarian response is the humanitarian needs of the people in Yemen, right across, irrespective of where they are. It is purely on a needs basis. It is absolutely vital that we recognise that where there is the resources to fulfil those needs, then we must, under the principles, under the clear duties I have as the humanitarian aid chief, we must seek to find the modalities by which we can, in accordance with international humanitarian law, ensure that that is made available to the various agencies and agents who are able to deliver that on the ground to the people in need. And therefore, I think it is not particularly appropriate, let alone particularly helpful at this stage, to make that linkage, which your question implied. And I hope you can appreciate the reason why. My priority is to be totally focused on relieving humanitarian need.
Mr. Badi.
I think I'm under some pressure to run to keep the various points here. As you probably appreciate, I'm 6 hours ahead of you. So I don't know how many more questions there are in the room, but I certainly have time for one more question.
Okay, actually, let me see whether I can. Can we take? Maybe I'll get two people to ask, and you can answer. Abdul Hamid and Mr. Badi, you've had your hands up for a while.
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you, Mr. Obrien, for this briefing. My name is Abadi from the paper Le Dossier. How much destruction was done to the infrastructure in Yemen, and to what degree does that constitute an impediment for the delivery of emergency assistance to Yemen?
And Abdul Hamid, please.
And, my name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Mr. O'Brien, yesterday, the special envoy Ismail Wild Sheikh Ahmed spoke about monitoring a truce once it is established. How feasible is that, knowing how difficult the terrain in Yemen and how large it is? Do you think having monitors will enhance the chances for the delivery of a humanitarian assistance?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I think I heard what you said in the first question, but it was about the distraction of there being damage to the infrastructure. Unquestionably, the distribution of aid is really hampered by the very poor infrastructure, of course. But let us be absolutely clear: the infrastructure is second to the issue about getting fuel into Yemen, because you have no means of delivery unless you have fuel, where even if you can get it to the ports, you have an onward transmission. So I use the answer to your inquiry to emphasize the need as a priority to get fuel into Yemen. They have always been dependent upon imports, and this is now, at the moment, seriously hampering infrastructure, including the potential for the hospital and medical and clinics, which are obviously dependent upon the fuel for their generation of whether it's cold stores, the cold trail for vaccines, or any of the other operational equipment that is required in these medical settings, let alone water pumps and for milling. So food, access to water are all affected. So the infrastructure issue, and of course it's a problem when roads and infrastructure is affected, but above all it's fuel that's required. And as for the question of monitoring truce, the Secretary General's Special Representative Ismail is absolutely right that the question of monitoring a truce is going to be vital, not least because it is a large country. It is an extraordinarily difficult terrain, as those familiar with it know. But in order to get the humanitarian aid in, if you have a pause, if you have a truce, you have to do your best to ensure that it is observed, and that the communication is not just from wherever a truce is agreed, but it actually then flows down the various chains of command and through communities. So yes, that is absolutely vital, and that will give us a chance. And as I draw to a close, may I take this opportunity to say that I'm very conscious this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to speak at the UN, to the UN press corps in New York. I'm sorry I'm not able to be in person, but I appreciate that this has been a first time that I've had in my new role as the USG ERC, and I appreciate the engagement and interaction that we have had.
Thanks very much for your time, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. So our guest has to go, and I just also wanted to let you know, I was just handed a note saying that the president of the Security Council is going to brief reporters at the stakeout shortly. So if you want to head over there, you're free to do so. Otherwise, I'll give you my own little bit of reading a few notes and taking some questions. First off, as you know, tomorrow we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. The Secretary General will be in San Francisco taking part in commemorative events. The main event, which will start at 12 p.m. Pacific time, will be shown live during a special event that will begin in Conference Room 2 at 2:40 p.m. here. UNTV will be able to provide broadcast quality video to those of you interested, and they will provide more information on how to get the video soon. The event in San Francisco, besides the Secretary General, will also feature remarks from the President of the General Assembly, the Governor of California, the Mayor of San Francisco, and the House Democratic Leader. And more information on the event is available on the UN 70 website. You just heard from Georg Kell, the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact this morning. Speaking at an event marking the 15th anniversary of the UN Global Compact, the Secretary General said that the initiative, which started as a simple call to action, has now become a global force for good. He added that it has been instrumental not just in reshaping global business practices, but also in opening the UN's doors to a business community that for too long saw little common ground or shared interest. His full remarks are available in our office and online. And I also have a related appointment. The Secretary General is today announcing the appointment of Lise Kingo of Denmark as Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. She will succeed Georg Kell, who retires later this year after over 25 years of service to the United Nations. The Secretary General expresses his gratitude for the outgoing Executive Director's services to the organization and for his commitment in fostering cooperation between the private sector and the United Nations. He's particularly appreciative of Mr. Kell's exemplary leadership in the creation and management of the United Nations Global Compact since its launch in 2000. Ms. Kingo, who assumes the role on the 1st of September, will bring a wealth of experience and passion to the Global Compact, coupled with extensive knowledge and understanding of strategic leadership and implementation of corporate sustainability through building partnerships with key stakeholders. She was most recently the Chief of Staff, Executive Vice President, and member of the Executive Management at Novo Nordisk AS from 2002 to 2014. And we have more information on this appointment in our office. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, says that a shortage of funds is hampering humanitarian and development assistance efforts to meet the needs of 3.9 million refugees who have fled the conflict in Syria, as well as more than 20 million people in affected local communities, hosting them in neighboring countries, according to a report released today. Only a little over $1 billion of the $4.5 billion called for in the Regional Refugee Plan has been received as of the end of May, or about 23%. The High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, has warned that we are so dangerously low on funding that we risk not being able to meet even the most basic survival needs of millions of people over the coming 6 months. Already, as a result of the funding shortfall, 1.6 million refugees have had their food assistance reduced this year. 750,000 children are not attending school. And life-saving health services are becoming too expensive for many, including 70,000 pregnant women at risk of unsafe deliveries. Some 86% of urban refugees in Jordan live below the poverty line, while 45% of refugees in Lebanon live in substandard shelters. There are more details on UNHCR's website. You saw that this morning, the Security Council extended the mandate of the UN operation in Côte d'Ivoire for another year. Also on Côte d'Ivoire, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Zeynab Hawa Bangoura, welcomed the signing commitment of 47 commanders from the Force Républicaine de Côte d'Ivoire to fight against sexual violence and ensure respect for international human rights and humanitarian law within all the units under their command. She said the signing was another concrete step by Côte d'Ivoire in consolidating the gains achieved since the end of the conflict, and she stressed that the chain of command must be fully engaged to work in ending the involvement of soldiers in sexual violence. More is available in a press release from her office. The Secretary General's Special Representative for Somalia, Nicholas Kay, has condemned in the strongest terms the attack on a United Arab Emirates convoy in Mogadishu yesterday that has resulted in some casualties. According to the UN Assistance Mission in Somalia, The attack was against civilians and international officials providing critical peace-building and state-building support to Somalia. More information is available online. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says that 2 months after the first of 2 devastating earthquakes hit Nepal, some 2.8 million of the people affected continue to require vital humanitarian assistance. Despite the needs, only 36% of the $422 million requested for humanitarian assistance has been received so far. The World Health Organization has also called on all partners to work together towards the early recovery and reconstruction of Nepal's healthcare systems. The agency warns that the health of people who survived the earthquakes could be at risk if we do not prioritize efforts to rebuild and restore regular health services. More information is available online. In his remarks to the press at the conclusion of his visit to the Republic of Korea, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Rad Al Hussein, said that the opening of a field office to work on the human rights situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a breakthrough that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago. He stressed that the people of the DPRK are currently facing the consequences of what appears to be the worst drought in living memory, compounded by decades of disastrous agricultural practices and chronic economic mismanagement. To avert the extremely high risk of famine, the government must engage with its neighbors and with humanitarian agencies. He added that the right to food, to health, and other social and economic rights are just as important as civil and political rights. Mr. Zaid also met with 3 Korean women who were forced to become comfort women during World War II. Calling for adequate and universal recognition of their suffering, he said that he firmly believes and hopes that a satisfactory solution could be found. His full remarks are available on the Human Rights Office's website. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed concern today at credible reports of excessive use of force by police officers in Armenia, including against journalists, in their handling of protests in Yerevan on the 23rd of June. The office calls on the authorities to investigate the incidents thoroughly and promptly. The office welcomes the statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Armenia expressing the government's commitment to democracy, fundamental freedoms, and protection of human rights in Armenia. It encourages the government to ensure that this commitment is translated in the way it responds to these protests, and it also encourages all parties to engage in a constructive dialogue and to refrain from violence. In terms of questions we've been asked in recent days, we were asked yesterday about civilian casualties in Yemen. Health facilities report that more than 2,800 people have been killed and 13,000 injured there since violence escalated in March. At least 1,400 civilians have lost their lives, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. UNICEF reports that as of the 16th of June, at least 279 children had been killed and 402 injured since the escalation of violence. We were also asked earlier about accountability in Sri Lanka. I can say that the new government in Sri Lanka has passed a constitutional amendment which, if implemented appropriately, brings renewed hope for democracy and the rule of law. In this regard, it is important that the government consults broadly with all political parties, civil society, and above all, victims and their families to ensure full national support and ownership of these processes. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights remains engaged in discussions with the Sri Lankan authorities on the need for transparent and inclusive processes to develop credible mechanisms for accountability and reconciliation. And last, concerning earlier questions on violence in Malakal, South Sudan, we can confirm that the UN mission in South Sudan reported violence involving Dinka and Chiluk youths at the Malakal protection of civilian sites on Tuesday. Clashes erupted during a violent demonstration by Darfuri traders and Dinka internally displaced people over the planned demolition of unauthorized shops in the new protection of civilians extension site. The mission's formed police unit personnel intervened, using tear gas to disperse the crowds. There were no reported casualties from this incident. For press conferences, tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. in this room, there will be a press conference ahead of the Rhythms of One World International Choral Festival. The festival is organized by the Permanent Mission of Romania to the United Nations and the Friendship Ambassadors Foundation with the support of the Department of Public Information. And then tomorrow, as the guest of the noon briefing, I'll be joined by Jean-Luc Lemayou, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime Director of the Division for Policy Analysis and Public Affairs, Thomas Pichman from the UN ODC Vienna, and Simone Minosabian, the Director of the UN ODC New York office. And they will brief on the launch of the new 2015 World Drug Report. And that is it for me. Are there any questions? Yes, Abdul Hamid.
Yes, Farhan. Rami Abdo, a member of the European Committee to Break the Siege on Gaza, said that they have delivered a letter to the Secretary General asking him to protect Flotilla Freedom 3, which now is about to sail from Greece to Gaza. First, do you confirm that the Secretary received this letter? And second, will he be doing something to protect the civilians, which is about 100 activists sailing to Gaza as we speak?
On your first question, we'll check on whether the letter's been received. As you're aware, we have repeatedly asked all parties to be very cautious in their actions in Gaza to make sure that all parties, all civilians are protected, but also to make sure that the very fragile nature of the situation in Gaza and the situation among Israelis and Palestinians is not unduly affected. As you know, our main priority is to make sure that the parties can return once more to negotiations with a view to achieving a two-state solution.
But in the meantime, Mr. Haq, there are 2 million under siege. They have been cut off from the whole world. And life goes on day after day, and they are still under siege.
Well, for us, we don't believe it as simply a case of life going on. We have continued, both from our offices on the ground in Gaza, all the way up through to the Secretary General, to see whether we can end the series of measures that have severely hurt all of the people of Gaza. You will have heard what the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeffrey Feltman, said to the Security Council regarding our concerns just yesterday afternoon. And of course, we continue to press on those arguments. Iftikhar?
Thank you, Farhan. Does the Secretary General have any thoughts on this huge death toll resulting from an unprecedented heat wave in Karachi? And does the United Nations plan to offer some aid to the government of Pakistan?
I'm not aware that we have received any actual requests from humanitarian assistance, so I'll check on that. But certainly our thoughts and our sympathies go out to all the people who've been suffering. It's amazing to know that hundreds of people have died from this awful heat wave that has struck Karachi, and we certainly hope that the situation there will be able to improve very swiftly. But if we're called upon to do something, of course we'll respond. But I'll need to check whether there's been any such request. Yes, Matthew.
I wanted to ask about Burundi. One of the vice presidents, Gervais Rufyikiri, has fled the country, and he said that after he came out in opposition to the current president running for a third term, he left in fear of his life to Belgium. So I wanted to know, that seems pretty, he's an elected official, et cetera. Is the UN doing anything to provide protection to people that feel under such threats within the country or trying to arrange for it? And what's the UN, how does this reflect on the dialogue the UN is trying to create?
Well, first of all, regarding the vice president, you'll have seen, of course, there have been other people who have also fled the country, and you'll have seen the concerns we've expressed at the time, and those concerns remain the case. We want all the people of Burundi to be able to live without fear, and we want, in particular, for the people who are going to be voting in any forthcoming elections, to be able to do so without fear, and to have the assurance that any elections will be free and inclusive. Regarding the dialogue on Burundi, that dialogue, which resumed on the 23rd of June, has in fact continued today with the special representative, Abdoulaye Batali's participation. Meanwhile, in New York, the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Jeffrey Feltman, met this morning with the permanent representative of Burundi to discuss the state of the electoral process. Yes, Majid.
Thank you, Farhan. I have a question about Syria. In the last 24 hours, the town of Kobani has been, ISIS has entered the town, and as we speak, there are reports that they are killing everybody they see there, and thousands are fleeing for their lives to the Turkish borders. My question here is, does the United Nations, I have two questions about this, the UN do anything to protect this these people and ask the Turkish authorities to facilitate and open the borders